Galactic Naval Academy, where the Empire's finest warriors train among the stars, one species has become the subject of endless ridicule. The humans, these soft pink creatures from a backwater world called Earth, stumble through combat simulations while their alien classmates sneer. Their reflexes seem sluggish, their technology primitive, their methods unorthodox. But in the shadow of mockery lies a terrifying truth that the galaxy is about to discover. When the kill ratios are finally calculated, some numbers don't lie. And some species don't just survive, they dominate. The morning sun of Kepler. 442b cast long shadows across the pristine bureaucrat of the Galactic Naval Academy as Sergeant Jake Morrison struggled to keep pace with his alien classmates. His human lungs burned in the thin atmosphere while around him, the Veltar cadets moved with fluid grace, their forearms pumping in perfect rhythm. The insectoid Crixani scuttled ahead on their 6 legs, mandibles clicking in what Morrison had learned was their equivalent of laughter. "Look at the pink-skinned struggle," hissed Zeltok, a Veltar warrior whose blue-scaled hide gleamed with morning dew. Perhaps they should have remained in their trees. Morrison bit back his response, focusing instead on the weight of his standard-issue plasma rifle and the tactical vest that seemed designed for beings with different anatomy entirely. 3 months into his training at the academy, he had grown accustomed to being the subject of ridicule. Were the newest species to join the Galactic Federation, barely 50 years since first contact, and their inclusion in the elite officer program was seen by many as a political gesture rather than recognition of military prowess. The academy itself was a marvel that still took Morrison's breath away. The towering spires of crystalline metal reached toward the alien sky, while training facilities that could simulate any environment in known space sprawled across hundreds of acres. Here, the finest military minds from across 17 species honed their skills, preparing to lead fleets that could glass entire worlds or defend them against impossible odds. Commander Vexa Nera, the Academy's lead instructor, stood waiting at the entrance to training complex. The Altarian's elongated skull gleamed beneath the morning light, her 4 eyes tracking each cadet with predatory precision. Her species had been warriors for millennia before humanity had learned to nap flint, and her reputation as a tactician was legendary even among the bloodthirsty Crexani. "Today marks the beginning of your advanced combat simulations," Vexnera announced, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made Altarian's speech sound like a funeral dirge. "You will be divided into mixed species squads and tasked with completing a series of increasingly difficult scenarios. Your performance will determine your final ranking, and ultimately, your assignment upon graduation." Morrison felt his pulse quicken. These rankings weren't just academic exercises. They determined which graduates would command Star Destroyers and which would find themselves relegated to cargo escort duty in the Outer Rim. For a human to achieve a top ranking would be unprecedented, and Morrison knew the eyes of his entire species were upon the small contingent of human cadets. The selection process began immediately. Squad assignments were supposedly random, but Morrison couldn't help but notice that the human cadets, all 12 of them, were distributed among different groups. Divide and conquer, he thought grimly. It was a classic tactic, one that would prevent the humans from supporting each other's unique approaches to combat. Morrison found himself assigned to Squad Theta 7, alongside 3 Veltar, 2 Crixani, a massive Gorvani whose species had evolved on a high-gravity world, and a Zephani whose telepathic abilities were supposedly invaluable in combat coordination. As they gathered in their designated briefing room, Morrison could feel the weight of 8 alien gazes upon him. "Wonderful," muttered Ketvar, one of the Veltar. "We have been saddled with dead weight." "The human may prove useful," chittered Rexazani, a Crixazani whose compound eyes reflected Morrison's image in fractal patterns. "Their species shows remarkable creativity in finding new ways to fail." Morrison had learned that the best response to such taunts was professional silence. He studied the mission briefing on his tablet while his squad mates continued their disparaging commentary. The scenario was straightforward enough. Infiltrate a rebel stronghold, eliminate or capture the leadership, and extract with minimal casualties. It was the kind of mission that real Federation forces carried out regularly across the galaxy. What made it challenging was the level of simulation fidelity. The Academy's combat systems used actual weapons, firing training charges that could incapacitate or cause genuine pain, while the enemy forces were controlled by advanced AI systems that had learned from actual combat data spanning centuries of galactic warfare. A cadet could emerge from these simulations with injuries that took days to heal, and more than one promising career had ended in a training accident. The briefing hologram materialized above their table, showing a three-dimensional representation of their target, a mining facility on an asteroid designated Sigma 47. The intelligence indicated that a cell of Nebula Liberation Front terrorists had seized control of the facility and were using it as a base of operations for attacks on Federation shipping lanes. The estimated enemy strength is 40 to 60 combatants, the hologram narrator explained in the Academy's standard galactic common. They are armed with military-grade weapons and have had time to prepare defensive positions. The civilian workers may still be present, requiring rules of engagement that minimize collateral damage. Morrison studied the facility's layout with professional interest. The rebels had chosen their position well, multiple levels connected by narrow choke points, with excellent sight lines for defensive fire. Any frontal assault would be costly. In the presence of civilians, complicated matters significantly. A straightforward assault is clearly the optimal approach, announced Thekmot, the Gorvani whose species had earned their place in the Federation through sheer physical prowess. Tall and massed like a small vehicle, Gorvani were living battering rams who had conquered their homeworld through direct application of overwhelming force. Agreed, hissed Zeltok. Protocol, we advance on multiple fronts simultaneously, overwhelming their defensive positions through coordinated fire and movement. Morrison found himself shaking his head before he could stop himself. The motion drew immediate attention from his alien squadmates, their various optical organs focusing on him with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. You disagree, human? Rexaani's mandibles clicked in what Morrison had learned was the Crixani equivalent of raised eyebrows. Insecurity? Perhaps you would share your profound tactical insights? There was no backing down now. Morrison cleared his throat and activated the hologram's tactical interface, highlighting specific areas of the facility with gestures of his hand. Their estate plays to their strengths, he explained, trying to keep his voice steady. They've had time to prepare kill zones at every entrance. Even if we succeed, casualties will be heavy, and civilian casualties are almost inevitable. And what would you propose instead? Kedvar's tone suggested that whatever Morrison might suggest would be inherently ridiculous. Morrison manipulated the hologram, zooming in on the facility's power distribution network. The entire complex is powered by a single fusion reactor located in the lower levels. If we can access the maintenance tunnels, here and here, a small team could disable the power grid while the main force creates a diversion at the primary entrance. Crawling through tunnels like vermin, spat Thekmot. Where's the honor in such tactics? Honor doesn't resurrect the dead, Morrison replied, drawing shocked silence from his squadmates. Such blunt pragmatism was apparently not common among species that had built their military traditions around concepts of glorious combat. Without power, their defensive systems go offline. No shields, no automated turrets, no internal communications. We could take the facility with minimal casualties on both sides. The Zafani, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, suddenly spoke. Her voice had the ethereal quality common to her telepathic species. The human's plan has merit, Sithana announced. His thoughts showed tactical patterns unfamiliar to standard Federation doctrine. Morrison wasn't sure whether being psychically analyzed was a compliment or an invasion of privacy, but he was grateful for the support. The other squadmates exchanged glances, or their species equivalent, as they considered this unexpected development. Very well, Zeltok finally conceded. We shall attempt this unconventional approach, but when it fails, human, the responsibility for our squad's humiliation will rest entirely upon your shoulders. The simulation began 2 hours later in Combat Arena 12, a massive facility that could reconfigure itself to match any environment. As Morrison and his squadmates donned their combat gear, he could see other squads preparing for their own scenarios. The temporary path. The human cadets and other squads looked nervous, and Morrison couldn't blame them. This was their chance to prove that humanity belonged among the galaxy's warrior elite. The arena transformed itself into a perfect replica of the mining asteroid, complete with the metallic tang of recycled air and the subtle vibration of mining equipment. Morrison checked his weapon, a standard Federation assault rifle modified to fire training charges, and reviewed the facility schematics one final time. Squad Theta 7, you are cleared for mission commencement. Commander Vexnar's voice echoed through their comm systems. Remember, your every action is being recorded and analyzed. Your future careers depend upon your performance here. No pressure at all, Morrison thought grimly as they approached the asteroid facility's main entrance. According to his plan, Thekmot and the two Veltar would create a noisy diversion while Morrison, Rexani, and Sithana infiltrated through the maintenance access. It was a plan that relied heavily on coordination and timing, two things that mixed-species units often struggled with. The first sign that something was wrong came when they reached the designated maintenance hatch. Morrison's portable scanner indicated the presence of motion sensors that hadn't appeared in the original briefing materials. Either the intelligence had been incomplete or the simulation's AI had adapted the scenario to increase difficulty. Additional security measures, Rexani observed, her compound eyes glittering in the dim light. Your human intelligence appears to be flawed. Adaptability is part of the test, Morrison replied, already studying alternative approaches. The enemy AI is supposed to learn from previous attempts. If other squads have tried similar tactics, it would have upgraded its defenses. This was the moment when Morrison's human heritage became either an asset or a liability. The other Federation species had developed their military traditions over millennia of warfare, creating elaborate doctrines and tactical frameworks that their officers studied for decades. Humans, by contrast, had barely figured out gunpowder when the Federation made first contact, and their military thinking was still evolving. What humans lacked in tradition, however, they made up for in adaptability. Morrison studied the sensor network with fresh eyes, looking for patterns that a more doctrinally minded officer might miss. The sensors were positioned to cover the obvious infiltration routes, but they formed a pattern based on assumptions about how infiltrators would think. There, he whispered, pointing to a seemingly impossible route that would require them to rappel down the asteroid's surface and enter through a waste disposal port. The sensors can't cover that approach angle without interfering with the facility's own systems. Madness, Rexani chittered. The disposal system will be heavily shielded and likely contaminated, which is exactly why they won't expect it, Morrison replied, already uncoiling his rappelling gear. Sometimes the best tactics are the ones that seem impossible. The descent down the asteroid's surface was harrowing. Artificial gravity was inconsistent, and Morrison found himself fighting vertigo as his inner ear struggled to adapt to the constantly shifting gravitational fields. Behind him, Rexani and Sithana followed with obvious reluctance, their alien physiology making the unconventional route even more challenging. The waste disposal port was exactly as disgusting as expected, but it was also unguarded and unmonitored. Morrison squeezed through the narrow opening, grateful for humanity's relatively compact build compared to some Federation species. The maintenance tunnels beyond were a maze of pipes and conduits, but Morrison's studying had paid off. He knew exactly where to go. Meanwhile, the diversion team was making plenty of noise at the main entrance. But through his comm system, Morrison could hear the distinctive whine of energy weapons and the thunderous footsteps of Thekmot's charge. The plan was working. Attention was focused on the obvious threat, while Morrison's team approached the power core. The fusion reactor was housed in a chamber that hummed with barely contained energy. Morrison studied the control systems with growing excitement. Patient technology was standardized across member species, meaning that his training on human systems translated directly to alien equipment. More importantly, the reactor's designers had never considered the possibility that someone might want to create a cascading shutdown rather than simply cutting power. This dictation asked, as Morrison began manipulating the reactor's control interface in ways that seemed random to his alien teammates. Creating a feedback loop, Morrison explained, his fingers dancing across the holographic controls. Instead of just cutting power, I'm making the reactor cycle through a diagnostic sequence that will take approximately 10 minutes to complete. During that time, power will fluctuate in a pattern that looks like normal maintenance rather than sabotage. I do not understand the tactical advantage, Rexani admitted, her mandibles clicking with confusion. Morrison's grin was visible even in the dim reactor room lighting. That between the Texas and the capital of Supremes, where secrets dance with royal protocol and whispers, by the time they figure out what's happening, we'll control the entire facility. The plan worked flawlessly. As power fluctuated throughout the complex, the rebel AI assumed it was experiencing routine maintenance issues. Defensive systems came online and offline in seemingly random patterns, creating gaps that Morrison's diversion team exploited with devastating effectiveness. By the time the AI realized it was under attack, Federation forces had already secured 3 of the facility's 5 levels. The final phase of the operation was a textbook example of combined arms tactics. With their defensive systems compromised and their communications disrupted, the rebel forces found themselves fighting a series of disconnected engagements rather than a coordinated defense. The Morrison squad captured the facility's command center with minimal casualties, while the simulated civilians were successfully evacuated without a single injury. When the simulation ended, Morrison found himself standing in the suddenly silent arena, his alien squadmates staring at him with expressions he couldn't interpret. The tactical display showed their mission results in stark numerical terms. Objective completed with 0 friendly casualties, 0 civilian casualties, and enemy losses minimized through strategic rather than kinetic means. Well, Zeltok finally said, his voice carrying a tone Morrison had never heard from the Veltar before. That was educational. Commander Vexnera's voice echoed through the arena as other squads completed their simulations. All units report to debriefing chambers for tactical analysis. Performance evaluations will be posted at 1800 hours. As they walked toward the debriefing chambers, Morrison caught glimpses of other squads emerging from their simulations. Some looked victorious, others appeared dejected, but Morrison noticed that several were sporting the telltale marks of training weapon impacts. Squad Theta 7, by contrast, looked exactly as they had when the simulation began. "UB," Rexani said quietly as they walked. "Your tactical approach was unlike anything in our standard curricula." "Different doesn't mean wrong," Morrison replied, trying to keep the satisfaction out of his voice. "No," the Crixani agreed, her compound eyes reflecting thoughts Morrison couldn't guess at. "It does not." The debriefing session was conducted by a panel of senior instructors representing multiple species. They reviewed each phase of the operation in detail, analyzing decisions and outcomes with the kind of thoroughness that Morrison had learned to expect from Federation military education. What surprised him was the tone of their questions. Instead of the barely concealed skepticism he had grown used to, the instructors seemed genuinely curious about his tactical reasoning. "Sergeant Morrison," Commander Vexnera addressed him directly, "your approach deviated significantly from standard Federation assault doctrines. What inspired these unconventional tactics?" Morrison considered his answer carefully. The truth was that human military history was full of examples where unconventional thinking had overcome superior force, but he suspected that wouldn't be the response his instructors wanted to hear. "Ma'am, I analyzed the scenario from the perspective of minimizing risk while maximizing effectiveness," he replied. The enemy's defensive preparations suggested they were familiar with standard Federation tactics, so I attempted to approach the problem from angles they wouldn't anticipate. "Interesting," mused Instructor Coltonan, a Zephani whose telepathic abilities made him particularly skilled at tactical analysis and the cascading power failure technique. "Where did you learn this approach?" "I adapted it from human industrial engineering principles, sir. My father was a power plant technician, and he taught me how complex systems can be disrupted through understanding their interconnections rather than simply cutting main power lines." A ripple of what Morrison had learned to interpret as surprise passed through the alien instructors. It seemed that the idea of adapting civilian technical knowledge to military applications was not common in Federation thinking. The session concluded with each squad member providing individual assessments of their team's performance. When it was Morrison's turn, he found himself facing the combined attention of some of the most experienced military minds in the galaxy. "Sergeant Morrison," Commander Vexnara said, "your squad mates have provided unanimous testimony that your tactical leadership was instrumental in achieving the mission objectives. This is unprecedented for a first-year human cadet. Do you have any explanation for this level of strategic thinking?" Morrison felt the weight of the moment. His answer could influence not just his own future, but the perception of humanity's military potential across the entire Federation. He thought about his species' history, the endless conflicts, the rapid technological advancement, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat even in the face of overwhelming odds. "Ma'am, I think humans approach warfare differently because we've had to," he said finally. Programs of developing elaborate military traditions over millennia. We didn't have the luxury of developing elaborate military traditions over millennia. We had to learn to think fast and adapt faster, or we died. The silence that followed was profound. Morrison could sense he had said something significant, though he wasn't sure what. "Dismissed," Commander Vexenera said eventually. "Performance evaluations will be posted this evening." As they left the debriefing chamber, Morrison's squad mates walked with him in thoughtful silence. The dynamic had shifted subtly but unmistakably. Where before they had treated him as a liability to be endured, now they seemed to regard him as something else entirely. "Sergeant Morrison," Sithana said as they reached the dormitory levels, "I would be interested in learning more about human tactical thinking. Would you be willing to share some of your people's military history?" "I'd be happy to," Morrison replied, surprised by the request. As word of Squad Theta 7's perfect performance spread through the academy, Morrison began to notice other changes in how he was treated. Human cadets from other squads sought him out for tactical discussions, while alien cadets who had previously ignored him began asking questions about human military philosophy. But Morrison knew that one successful simulation didn't prove anything. The Academy's advanced combat scenarios would become progressively more challenging, and there were still months of training ahead before graduation. The real test of human military potential was still to come. That evening, as promised, performance evaluations were posted throughout the Academy. Detector. Morrison stood before the holographic display with growing amazement as he read the results. Squad Theta 7 had achieved the highest overall score in Academy history for the opening advanced simulation. More remarkably, Morrison's individual tactical leadership rating placed him in the top 5% of all cadets in his year, an achievement that no human had ever reached. Around him, alien cadets studied the results with expressions ranging from surprise to grudging respect. The conventional wisdom about human military capabilities was beginning to crack, and Morrison could sense that everything was about to change. But as he walked back to his quarters that night, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that their perfect performance had attracted attention from quarters that might not welcome humanity's success. The galaxy was full of species that had built their identities around military supremacy, and the idea that a newly arrived species might challenge their dominance would not be welcomed by all. The real test was just beginning. The mess hall buzzed with an undercurrent of tension that Morrison had never felt before. 3 weeks had passed since Squad Theta 7's record-breaking performance, and the atmosphere at the Academy had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Where once human cadets had been ignored or dismissed, now they found themselves the subject of intense scrutiny from their alien classmates. Morrison sat with his usual breakfast of synthesized protein and carbohydrates, watching as clusters of alien cadets engaged in animated discussions that seemed to focus frequently in his direction. The universal translator built into his neural implant couldn't capture the emotional subtleties of their various languages, but body language was often more revealing than words. "They're talking about us again," muttered Corporal Sarah Chen, one of the other human cadets who had begun seeking Morrison's tactical advice after his simulation success. "I overheard some Veltar saying that human tactics are dishonorably effective." Morrison looked up from his meal to see Chen's expression, a mixture of pride and concern that he recognized because he felt it himself. Being noticed was better than being ignored, but the attention came with pressures that none of them had expected. "Dishonorably effective sounds like a compliment to me," replied Private Marcus Webb, the youngest human cadet at barely 18 years old. "Better than what they were calling us last month." "Is it, though?" Chen asked quietly. "Some of the instructors have been asking pointed questions about human military history, specifically about our tendency toward what they call asymmetric warfare." Morrison knew what she meant. Humanity's rise to technological civilization had been marked by conflicts where superior strategy and unconventional thinking had overcome numerical or technological disadvantages. From ancient battles where smaller forces had defeated vast armies through tactical innovation, to modern conflicts where information warfare had proven as decisive as kinetic weapons, human military history was full of examples that might make other species uncomfortable. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Commander Vex's Nara, whose presence in the mess hall was unusual enough to draw attention from across the room. The Altarian moved with her characteristic predatory grace between the tables until she reached Morrison's position. "Sergeant Morrison," she said, her four eyes focusing on him with unsettling intensity. "Report to Training Complex 9 at 0800 hours. You'll be participating in a specialized tactical analysis session." "Ma'am, may I ask the nature of the session?" Morrison replied, standing at attention despite the informal setting. "You may not," Vexnara responded curtly. "Bring your full combat kit. And Sergeant, you'll be working with a new unit composition today." As the commander moved away, Morrison noticed that similar conversations were taking place at other tables throughout the mess hall. But whatever was happening, it involved more than just him. Training Complex 9 was one of the Academy's most advanced facilities, normally reserved for final-year cadets and special operations training. Morrison had never been inside before, and he was struck by the sophisticated holographic systems and neural interface equipment that lined the walls. This wasn't just simulation. This was full immersion tactical training where participants could experience combat scenarios with complete sensory fidelity. He wasn't alone in the briefing chamber. 12 other cadets had been selected from across multiple species and year levels, including several that Morrison recognized as top performers from their respective programs. What surprised him was the inclusion of Cadet Richter, a Crixitizer whose tactical philosophy was diametrically opposed to Morrison's own, and Cadet Molketh, a Veltar who had publicly criticized human methods as lacking honor. "Interesting selection criteria," murmured a voice beside him. Morrison turned to see Cadet Zara al-Rashid, one of only 3 other humans in the group. Al-Rashid had distinguished herself in communications and electronic warfare, fields where human adaptability had proven particularly valuable. Before Morrison could respond, the chamber's main holographic display activated, revealing the imposing figure of Admiral Keth Voran, the Academy's commanding officer. The Gorvani's massive form dominated the display, his dark eyes scanning the assembled cadets with an expression that Morrison couldn't interpret. "Cadets," the Admiral began, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made Gorvani's speech sound like distant thunder, "you have been selected for participation in Exercise Deep Strike, a classified tactical analysis program designed to evaluate unconventional warfare methodologies." Morrison felt his pulse quicken. Classified exercises were extremely rare at the Academy, usually reserved for situations where the Federation faced genuine strategic challenges. "For the past 50 standard years," Admiral Keth Verona continued, "Federation military doctrine has evolved around the assumption that our technological and numerical superiority would be decisive in any conflict. Recent intelligence suggests this assumption may be flawed." The holographic display changed to show a star map highlighting the Federation's outer territories. Red indicators marked locations that Morrison didn't recognize, but their distribution suggested some kind of pattern. "The Hegemony Coalition has been conducting increasingly sophisticated raids against our outer colonies," the Admiral explained. "Their forces are numerically inferior and technologically outmatched, yet they continue to achieve tactical victories that our standard doctrines cannot explain or counter." Morrison exchanged glances with al-Rashid. The Hegemony Coalition was composed of several non-Federation species that had refused to join the galactic government, instead forming their own loose alliance based on mutual defense agreements. Intelligence reports about them were restricted, but rumors suggested they were becoming increasingly aggressive in their opposition to Federation expansion. "Your mission," Admiral Keth Voran continued, "is to analyze hegemony tactics and develop counter-strategies using unconventional approaches that may not conform to standard Federation doctrine. You will be divided into teams of mixed composition and given access to actual combat data from recent engagements." The implications were staggering. Morrison realized that this wasn't just an advanced training exercise. They were being asked to help solve real strategic problems that had apparently stumped the Federation's regular military leadership. "Cadet Morrison," the Admiral addressed him directly, "you will lead Team Alpha, composed of yourself, Cadets al-Rashid, Richter, and Molketh. Your team will analyze the Battle of Kepler Station and develop alternative tactical approaches." Autistic Morrison noticed the careful selection of his team members. Al-Rashid's electronic warfare expertise would complement his own tactical thinking, while Richter and Molketh represented more traditional Federation approaches. It was clearly designed to force different philosophical perspectives to work together. The briefing chamber reconfigured itself into smaller workspaces, each equipped with holographic displays and access to classified military databases. As Morrison's team settled into their assigned area, he could feel the tension radiating from his alien teammates. "Before we begin," Molketh said, his Veltar features set in an expression Morrison had learned indicated skepticism, "I wish to understand why a first-year human has been placed in command of this team." "Because his unconventional methods achieved unprecedented results," Richter replied before Morrison could respond. "However distasteful those methods may be to traditional military thinking." Morrison decided to address the tension directly. "Look, I know that human tactics seem strange to you. They seem strange to us sometimes too. But if the Admiral is right, and conventional approaches aren't working against the hegemony, then maybe strange is exactly what we need." Al-Rashid activated the holographic display, bringing up the tactical data from the Battle of Kepler Station. Morrison studied the information with growing interest and dismay. A Federation fleet of 17 ships, including 2 battlecruisers and a carrier, had been decisively defeated by a hegemony force less than half its size. The official report attributed the loss to unexpected tactical innovations, but the raw data told a more disturbing story. "Yet several tribbles of conflicts," Morrison said quietly, causing his teammates to look at him with varying degrees of confusion and alarm. "Explain," Richter chittered, her compound eyes focusing intently on the display. Morrison highlighted specific elements of the battle data as he spoke. "Look at the engagement patterns. Instead of the formal battle lines that Federation doctrine expects, the hegemony forces used hit-and-run tactics, attacking supply lines and communication relays rather than engaging the main fleet directly. They turned the Federation's technological advantages against them by forcing fights in asteroid fields and nebulae where sensors were degraded and long-range weapons were ineffective." "You consider this admirable?" Molketh asked, his tone suggesting that he found the idea disturbing. "I consider it effective," Morrison replied. "They analyzed their enemy's strengths and found ways to neutralize them while maximizing their own advantages. That's not dishonorable. That's intelligent." Al-Rashid was studying the electronic warfare aspects of the battle with obvious fascination. "They're using adaptive jamming techniques that I've only seen in theoretical papers," she observed. "Each time the Federation forces adapted to their electronic countermeasures, the hegemony shifted to entirely different approaches rather than trying to overcome the Federation's response. It's like they expected adaptation and had multiple contingency plans ready," Morrison added. "That suggests a fundamentally different approach to tactical planning." The team spent hours analyzing the battle data, with Morrison guiding them through analytical techniques that emphasized adaptability over rigid doctrine. He found himself explaining concepts that were second nature to human military thinking, but seemed revolutionary to his alien teammates. "Human warfare evolved differently because our planet forced us to," Morrison explained during one particularly intense discussion. We had multiple species competing for limited resources, which meant that any tactical approach that became predictable would be countered by competitors. Success required constant innovation and adaptation. "But surely this led to chaos and inefficiency," Richter objected, "and allows for coordinated operations across vast scales. Only if your enemy is also using standardized doctrine," Al-Rashid interjected. "But what happens when you face an opponent who deliberately avoids predictable patterns?" The question hung in the air as they continued their analysis. A prisoner gradually emerged of the hegemony's tactical philosophy that was both alien to Federation thinking and strangely familiar to the human team members. The hegemony forces seemed to embrace unpredictability as a strategic advantage, using rapid tactical shifts to keep Federation forces off balance and unable to bring their superior firepower to bear effectively. They're treating each engagement as part of a larger campaign rather than isolated battles. Morrison realizes every fight is designed to gather intelligence and test Federation responses, even the ones they lose. They're learning faster than we are. The implications were sobering. Federation military doctrine was built around the assumption that superior technology and training would ensure victory in any prolonged conflict. But if the enemy was learning and adapting faster than Federation forces could respond, then traditional advantages might become liabilities. Bing. So what do we recommend? Molketh asked. And Morrison was surprised to hear genuine curiosity in the Veltar's voice rather than skepticism. Morrison looked at his teammates, seeing uncertainty, but also engagement. For the first time since arriving at the academy, he felt like he was working with aliens rather than being tolerated by them. We recommend that Federation forces learn to think like the hegemony, Morrison said. We need to develop tactical flexibility that allows our commanders to adapt in real time rather than following predetermined battle plans. And how would you implement such a change? Rickster asked. Al-Rashid answered before Morrison could speak. By training officers to think like humans, she said simply. Our species has been dealing with unpredictable opponents for our entire evolutionary history. We're naturally adapted for tactical flexibility. The silence that followed was profound. Morrison realized that Al-Rashid had just articulated something that could fundamentally change how the Federation approached military training and doctrine. Their presentation to Admiral Kethvoran and the Academy's senior staff was scheduled for the following day. Morrison spent most of the night refining their recommendations, knowing that the implications extended far beyond academic exercises. If they were right, it meant that humanity's apparently chaotic approach to warfare might actually be exactly what the Federation needed to counter the growing hegemony threat. The presentation chamber was packed with more senior officers than Morrison had ever seen in one place. Representatives from multiple species filled the seats, their various forms of attention focused intently on the small group of cadets who had been asked to solve problems that had stumped experienced military leaders. Demand a presentation with a detailed analysis of the Battle of Kepler Station, walking through the tactical sequence while highlighting the systematic way that hegemony forces had neutralized Federation advantages. He could see surprise and concern spreading through the audience as the implications became clear. The hegemony is not simply using unconventional tactics, Morrison explained. They have developed an entirely different approach to warfare that treats adaptability as more important than firepower or technology. Area engagement is part of a learning process that makes them more effective in subsequent battles. Al-Rashid followed with her analysis of the electronic warfare aspects, demonstrating how the hegemony's rapid shifts between different jamming and countermeasures techniques had prevented Federation forces from developing effective responses. Their approach suggests influence from species that evolved in highly competitive environments, she concluded. Species that were forced to develop rapid adaptation as a survival mechanism. The audience stirred at this observation, and Morrison saw several officers exchanging meaningful glances. The advisors was becoming clearer. Rickster presented their tactical recommendations with the careful precision, typical of her species, but Morrison was pleased to note that she had embraced the flexibility concepts that had initially seemed alien to her thinking. Doctrine assumes that standardized approaches will be superior because they allow for coordinated operations, she explained. However, this assumption fails when facing opponents who specifically design their tactics to counter standardized responses. Apples concluded their presentation with what Morrison considered the most important recommendation, that Federation military training needed to incorporate what he called adaptive thinking methodologies that would allow officers to develop tactical flexibility rather than simply memorizing doctrine. A human approach to warfare appears chaotic to species accustomed to formal military traditions, Molketh acknowledged. However, this apparent chaos may actually represent a more sophisticated form of order, one that embraces unpredictability as a strategic advantage. When they finished, the chamber remained silent for long enough that Morrison began to worry they had somehow offended their audience. Finally, Admiral Kethvoran stood, his massive frame drawing attention from across the room. Cadets, he rumbled, you have presented analysis that contradicts 50 years of accepted Federation military doctrine. Your conclusions suggest that our fundamental approach to warfare may be inadequate against certain types of opponents. Morrison felt his heart sink. Had they gone too far in their criticism of traditional approaches? You have also, the Admiral continued, provided the first coherent explanation for recent tactical failures that our best military minds have been unable to understand. More importantly, you have suggested practical solutions that could be implemented within existing command structures. The Admiral's dark eyes focused on Morrison with an intensity that was almost physical. Cadet Morrison, your tactical analysis demonstrates thinking patterns that are clearly outside standard Federation training. Where did you develop these approaches? Morrison thought carefully before responding. The truth was complicated, involving humanity's chaotic military history and their species' natural adaptation to unpredictable environments. Sir, I think humans developed these approaches because we didn't have a choice, he said finally. Our homeworld forced us to compete with multiple intelligent species for resources, which meant that any predictable strategy would eventually be countered. We learned to value adaptability over consistency, because consistency meant death. Fascinating, murmured General Thisiskova, a Zafani whose telepathic abilities had made her one of the Federation's most effective intelligence officers. And you believe these adaptive thinking patterns can be taught to other species? Yes, ma'am, Al-Rashid answered. The human military academies spend significant time teaching officers to think creatively and adapt to unexpected situations. These techniques could be incorporated into Federation training programs. The discussion that followed lasted for hours, with senior officers from multiple species asking detailed questions about human military philosophy and training methodologies. Morrison found himself explaining concepts that he had never really analyzed consciously, approaches that seemed natural to human thinking, but were apparently revolutionary to their alien colleagues. When the session finally concluded, Admiral Keth Vorin announced that their recommendations would be forwarded to Federation High Command for consideration as part of a comprehensive review of military doctrine. Cadets, he concluded, you have contributed to strategic thinking at the highest levels of Federation military planning. This is unprecedented for Academy students of any species. As they left the presentation chamber, Morrison's teammates walked with him in thoughtful silence. The dynamic between them had changed completely. What had begun as reluctant cooperation had evolved into something approaching mutual respect. Morrison, Richter said as they reached the dormitory levels, I owe you an apology. I believed human tactical thinking was simply undisciplined. I now understand that what appears to be chaos may actually be a more sophisticated form of organization. We all learned something, Morrison replied diplomatically, but privately he wondered what the long-term implications would be. If the Federation really did adopt human-style tactical thinking, it would represent a fundamental shift in how galactic military forces operated. And if they were successful against the hegemony, it might change how other species viewed humanity's place in the galactic order. The real test was still ahead, and Morrison suspected that success would bring challenges that none of them had anticipated. 6 weeks after the classified briefing, Morrison found himself standing in the Academy's primary tactical command center at 0:30, wondering how his life had become so complicated. The message had been simple: report immediately for emergency deployment. The reality was far more complex. Around him, the command center buzzed with activity as senior officers coordinated what appeared to be a real military operation rather than a training exercise. Holographic displays showed star charts marked with red indicators, while communication specialists maintained contact with fleet units across multiple sectors. Sergeant Morrison, Commander Vex's Nara, appeared at his shoulder with her characteristic silent approach. You and your tactical analysis team are being deployed as military observers aboard the Federation cruiser Relentless. Pack for extended operations. Ma'am, may I ask the nature of the mission? Morrison replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline surge caused by the word deployment. The Hegemony Coalition has launched coordinated attacks against 3 Federation colonies in the Outer Rim, Vex Nara explained briskly. Fleet Command wants real-time tactical analysis from observers who understand their operational patterns. Morrison felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. 3 weeks ago, he had been a cadet struggling to keep up with his alien classmates. Now he was being sent to observe actual combat operations where real people would live or die based on tactical decisions. Within 2 hours, Morrison and his hastily assembled team were aboard a military transport heading for the Outer Rim. Al-Rashid sat across from him, checking her electronic warfare equipment with the methodical precision that had made her one of the Academy's top specialists in her field. Richter occupied a specially designed acceleration couch that accommodated her Crixini physiology, while Molketh meditated in the manner common to his species before combat. The journey through hyperspace gave Morrison time to study the intelligence reports that had been classified above his security clearance just weeks before. What he read made his blood run cold. The hegemony's latest attacks weren't random raids. They were systematic probes designed to test Federation response capabilities across multiple sectors simultaneously. Each attack had been carefully calibrated to force Federation forces into specific response patterns, creating a comprehensive intelligence picture of fleet capabilities and doctrine. "They're preparing for something bigger," Al-Rashid observed, reading over his shoulder. "These attacks are too well coordinated to be opportunistic raiding." "Agreed," Morrison replied, highlighting specific patterns in the attack data. "Look at the timing intervals. Is scheduled to allow Federation forces just enough time to develop countermeasures before shifting to a completely different attack vector. They're not trying to hold territory, they're trying to map our entire tactical response repertoire." Molketh's meditation posture shifted slightly, indicating that he was listening despite appearing to be in a trance state. "If your analysis is correct," he said without opening his eyes, "then we are walking into a carefully prepared trap." The thought had occurred to Morrison as well, but he had been hoping he was wrong. The hegemony's systematic approach to intelligence gathering suggested planning on a scale that would require months or years of preparation. Whatever they were ultimately planning, the current attacks were just the preliminary phase. The Federation cruiser Relentless was a Sovereign-class vessel that represented the pinnacle of Federation naval architecture. At 800 meters long and carrying a crew of 1,200 from 7 different species, it was a floating city dedicated to projecting military power across interstellar distances. Morrison had studied ships like this in tactical analysis courses, but being aboard one was an entirely different experience. Captain Veltarim was a Veltar whose reputation as a combat commander was legendary throughout the fleet. Morrison had read about her victory at the Battle of Rigel Prime, where her innovative use of asteroid cover had allowed a single cruiser to defeat an entire pirate squadron. Meeting her in person was intimidating in ways that Morrison hadn't expected. "So," Captain Veltarim said as she reviewed their orders in her ready room, "Fleet Command has decided that cadets can provide tactical insights that experienced officers cannot." I confess myself curious about this development. Morrison felt the weight of skepticism in her tone, but also genuine interest. "Ma'am, I believe the idea is that our lack of experience with traditional Federation doctrine might allow us to see patterns that trained officers would automatically filter out." "An interesting theory," the captain mused. "We shall test it soon enough." The hegemony has been conducting harassment operations in this sector for the past week, and our response has been ineffective. The briefing that followed was sobering. Federation forces had responded to each hegemony attack with textbook precision, deploying overwhelming force to drive off the raiders and protect Federation assets. The problem was that the hegemony forces seemed to anticipate every response, positioning themselves to gather maximum intelligence while minimizing their own losses. "They're treating us like a laboratory experiment," Morrison realized. "They learned something new about our capabilities and doctrine." "Then what would you recommend?" Captain Veltarim asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. "Patterns." Morrison studied the tactical displays showing recent engagement patterns, looking for opportunities that conventional thinking might have missed. The answer, when it came to him, was both obvious and revolutionary. "We stop giving them what they want," he said simply. "Instead of responding to their attacks with overwhelming force, we respond with unpredictable force. Sometimes we ignore their raids entirely. Sometimes we respond with far more firepower than the situation warrants. Sometimes we respond in ways that serve our intelligence-gathering needs rather than theirs." "You're suggesting we allow Federation assets to be attacked without response?" Captain Veltarim's voice carried dangerous undertones. "No, ma'am. I'm suggesting we choose our responses based on strategic value rather than tactical doctrine. If a raid is clearly designed to test our electronic warfare capabilities, we respond with a purely kinetic attack that tells them nothing about our ECM systems. If they're probing our sensor networks, we give them false data that leads them to incorrect conclusions about our detection ranges." Al-Rashid nodded enthusiastically. "We turn their intelligence-gathering operation against them by feeding them carefully crafted misinformation. The concept was so simple that Morrison was surprised it hadn't occurred to anyone before. Then he realized that it probably had occurred to Federation officers, but their training would have discouraged them from implementing it. Deliberate deception and misdirection were tactics that most Federation species considered dishonorable, even against enemies. Fascinating, Captain Veltaharim said thoughtfully. And you believe this approach would be effective against the hegemony's current tactics? I think it's worth trying, Morrison replied. Scenario is that we learn something about their adaptability. The best case is that we start feeding them false intelligence that degrades their overall strategic planning. The opportunity to test Morrison's theories came sooner than expected. Long-range sensors detected a small hegemony force moving toward a Federation communications relay station in the outer system. Based on their approach vector and force composition, it appeared to be another intelligence-gathering probe designed to test Federation response times and electronic warfare capabilities. Dressed, standard doctrine would call for dispatching a patrol squadron to drive them off while protecting the relay station. Captain Veltaharim observed from her command chair on the Relentless's bridge. What would you recommend instead? Morrison studied the tactical display, noting the careful positioning of the hegemony force and the obvious intelligence-gathering opportunities that the raid represented. His recommendation when he made it surprised even himself. I recommend we let them attack the relay station, he said quietly. But we modify the station's database to contain false information about fleet dispositions and capabilities. When they access the communications logs, they'll discover data that appears authentic but is actually designed to mislead their strategic planning. You want to use our own assets as bait? The question came from Commander Ket Soren, the ship's Veltar tactical officer, whose expression suggested he found the idea disturbing. I want to turn their intelligence operation into our intelligence operation, Morrison replied. By denying them information, we give them information that serves our strategic interests. The plan required precise coordination and timing. The relay station's automated systems had to be reprogrammed with false data that would appear authentic under casual inspection, but would lead to incorrect conclusions about Federation fleet strength and positioning. Meanwhile, Al-Rashid worked with the ship's communications specialists to ensure that the false data would be prioritized by hegemony intelligence gathering systems. This feels like cheating, Molketh observed as they watched the hegemony force approach the relay station on the main display. Good, Morrison replied. If we're going to fight opponents who don't follow Federation rules, then we need to be willing to break Federation rules ourselves. The attack proceeded exactly as Federation doctrine predicted. The hegemony force disabled the relay station's defenses with surgical precision, accessed its database, and withdrew before Federation response forces could arrive. From a traditional perspective, it was another successful enemy intelligence gathering operation. From Morrison's perspective, it was the beginning of a strategic deception that could change the entire dynamic of the conflict. Results became apparent over the following days as Federation intelligence intercepts revealed hegemony forces repositioning based on the false fleet data they had acquired from the relay station. Enemy units were being deployed to counter Federation strengths that didn't exist, while leaving real Federation assets undefended. Remarkable, Captain Veltaharim admitted as they reviewed the intelligence reports. Your unconventional approach has achieved results that months of traditional tactics failed to produce. But Morrison was already thinking several moves ahead. The hegemony would eventually realize they had been deceived, and their response would likely be both swift and devastating. Success in the current operation would only buy time to prepare for escalation. Captain, he said carefully, I believe we need to prepare for the possibility that the hegemony will respond to our deception with a significant escalation of force. What makes you think so? Commander Ket Soren asked. Morrison highlighted specific patterns in the hegemony's operational history displayed on the tactical screen. Every time they've encountered effective Federation countermeasures, their response has been to shift to an entirely different level of operations. Our deception has been effective, which means they'll probably abandon their current approach and try something completely different, such as, Captain Veltaharim prompted. Direct assault, Al-Rashid answered before Morrison could respond. If subtle intelligence gathering isn't working, they'll shift to overwhelming force designed to achieve their objectives through kinetic means rather than information warfare. The prediction proved accurate sooner than any of them had hoped. Long-range sensors detected a massive hegemony fleet moving toward Federation space, not the small raiding forces they had been dealing with, but a full battle group capable of challenging Federation control over entire sectors. Captain is recalling all available units to defensive positions. Captain Velterim announced after receiving updated orders. It appears that your success has provoked exactly the escalation you predicted. Morrison felt a mixture of pride and dread. If his tactical innovations had worked, but they had also triggered a level of conflict that could result in casualties on a scale the Federation hadn't seen in decades. Player. Ma'am, he said carefully, I request permission to continue serving as a tactical observer during the coming engagement. Denied, Captain Velterim replied immediately. You're cadets, not combat officers. I'm having you transferred back to Academy Control before we engage the main hegemony force. With respect, Captain, our analysis capabilities may be needed during the battle itself, Morrison persisted. The hegemony has consistently demonstrated tactical innovation that surprises traditional Federation. Our outside perspective might provide insights that could save lives. The debate that followed involved several senior officers and ultimately required a decision from Fleet Command itself. In the end, Morrison and his team were granted permission to remain aboard the Relentless as observers, but with strict orders to avoid direct involvement in combat operations. The Federation fleet that assembled to meet the hegemony assault was the largest military formation Morrison had ever seen. 17 capital ships supported by dozens of cruisers and frigates with fighter squadrons that could darken entire sectors of space. It was a demonstration of military power that should have been overwhelming against any possible opponent. But as Morrison studied the tactical displays showing the approaching hegemony force, he felt a growing sense of unease. The enemy fleet was significantly smaller than the Federation force, but their formation and approach vectors suggested tactical thinking that was far more sophisticated than their previous operations. The protocol is realized suddenly. They're planning to fight us, he realized suddenly. They're planning to fight our doctrine. Explain, Captain Velterim ordered from her command chair. Morrison highlighted specific elements of the enemy formation on the main display. Look at their positioning. They're not trying to achieve numerical superiority at any point of contact. Instead, they're positioned to exploit the predictable ways that Federation doctrine says will respond to their attack. You believe they're setting another trap? Commander Ketsoran asked. I believe they're setting the ultimate trap, Morrison replied grimly. They've spent months studying our tactical responses to small-scale operations. Now they're going to use that knowledge against us in a large-scale engagement, where the stakes are high enough that we can't afford to deviate from established doctrine. The implications were terrifying. If Morrison was right, then the Federation fleet was sailing into a battle where the enemy had already planned counters for every move they were likely to make. It would be like playing chess against an opponent who could see all of your pieces while keeping their own hidden. What would you recommend? Captain Velterim asked quietly. Morrison looked around the bridge at the alien officers who had become his reluctant colleagues, then at his human teammate who had helped him develop the analytical framework that had brought them to this moment. I recommend we do something completely unexpected, he said finally. Something so far outside Federation doctrine that they can't possibly have planned for it. Such as? Morrison's answer when he gave it would have been impossible to imagine when he first arrived at the academy as a mocked human cadet, struggling to keep up with his alien classmates. I recommend we fight like humans, he said simply. No doctrine, no predictable responses, no honor-bound tactical limitations. We adapt to every move they make and force them to react to us instead of the other way around. The silence that followed was broken only by the ambient sounds of the ship's systems. Morrison had just suggested that the Federation fleet abandon decades of military tradition in favor of the chaotic adaptive approach that had made humanity both feared and ridiculed throughout their violent history. Fascinating, Captain Velterim said eventually. And you believe this approach would be effective against a numerically inferior but tactically sophisticated opponent? I believe it's the only approach that has a chance of working, Morrison replied. Present has already been anticipated and countered. As the two fleets closed to engagement range, Morrison found himself at the center of a tactical revolution that would either save the Federation or destroy its military credibility forever. The mocked Earth Marine was about to find out whether human warfare could translate to galactic conflict, and whether the galaxy was ready for what humanity brought to the art of war. The Battle of Meridian Reach began like every major fleet engagement in Federation history, with precise formations, calculated firing solutions, and the kind of methodical approach to warfare that had served the Federation well for over a century. It would end in a way that no military academy had ever taught and no alien species had ever witnessed. Morrison stood at the tactical analysis station aboard the Relentless, watching 17 Federation capital ships arrange themselves in the traditional battle line formation that had been refined through decades of successful engagements. Each ship knew its position, its firing arc, and its role in the complex choreography of interstellar warfare. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Commander Ketsoran observed, watching the formation take shape on the main display. 300 years of military evolution made manifest. Morrison nodded, but his attention was focused on the Hegemony fleet's response to the Federation deployment. As he had predicted, the enemy forces were positioning themselves in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of Federation tactical doctrine. They weren't trying to match the Federation's formation. They were positioning themselves to exploit its predictable elements. "Captain," Morrison said quietly, "I'm seeing movement patterns that suggest the Hegemony has prepared specific counters for our standard battle line formation." Captain Velterim turned from her command chair to study the tactical display Morrison was highlighting. Her four eyes tracked the enemy movements with the kind of professional assessment that came from years of combat experience. "Explain your analysis," she ordered. Morrison manipulated the holographic display to show predicted firing solutions and movement vectors. The Hegemony ships are positioning themselves in clusters that would be vulnerable to coordinated broadside fire if we were planning to maintain our current formation. But their positioning suggests they expect us to shift to a pincer movement when we close to weapons range. Standard tactical doctrine for engaging a numerically inferior enemy, Commander Ketsoran agreed. Divide our force to envelop their formation and prevent their escape, which means they prepared counters for both our current formation and our most likely tactical evolution, Al-Rashid added from her electronic warfare station. "We're walking into a battle where they've already planned responses to our moves." The realization was spreading through the bridge crew like ripples in water. The Federation fleet was approaching an engagement where the enemy had potentially negated their primary advantages through superior intelligence and tactical preparation. "Fleet Command is signaling for standard engagement protocol," the communications officer reported. "All ships are to maintain formation until we close to optimal firing range." Morrison felt his stomach clench as he watched the Federation fleet continue its approach according to textbook doctrine. In a few minutes, the most powerful military formation the Federation had assembled in decades would find itself fighting an enemy that had spent months preparing specifically for this type of engagement. "Captain," Morrison said urgently, "I request permission to propose an alternative tactical approach to Fleet Command." "You're a cadet," Captain Veltherim replied, though her tone suggested consideration rather than dismissal. "Fleet Command doesn't accept tactical recommendations from cadets, but they might accept recommendations from experienced combat commanders," Morrison replied, "because, especially if those recommendations are based on analysis that explains recent tactical failures." The bridge fell silent, except for the ambient hum of the ship's systems. Morrison realized that he was asking a career officer to risk her reputation on the tactical theories of a human cadet who had been mocked by his classmates just months ago. "What exactly are you proposing?" Captain Velterim asked carefully. Morrison took a deep breath and activated the tactical display's projection system. "I propose we abandon formation doctrine entirely," he said. "Instead of fighting as a coordinated fleet, we fight as individual units using independent tactical judgment to exploit opportunities as they develop." The response was immediate and predictable. Commander Ketsoran voiced the objection that Morrison expected. "That's not tactics. That's chaos. Coordinated fleet actions require formation discipline to maximize firepower and protect individual units from being overwhelmed. Only if the enemy is also following formation doctrine," Morrison replied. "But look at their positioning. They're not fighting as a traditional fleet either. They've organized into independent battle groups that can support each other while maintaining tactical flexibility." Al-Rashid was studying her electronic warfare displays with growing excitement. "Morrison's right," she announced. "The Hegemony isn't using standard command and control protocols. Each battle group appears to be operating with complete tactical independence, which means their response to our formation changes will be limited by the communication delays between their battle groups, Morrison continued. Why? If we break formation and engage them with independent tactical units, we force them to react to multiple simultaneous threats instead of implementing a single coordinated response. The tactical theory was sound, but implementing it would require the Federation fleet to abandon the coordinated approach that was the foundation of their military doctrine. It was asking experienced commanders to throw away everything they had learned about large-scale fleet operations. Captain, the communications officer interrupted. Fleet Command is requesting our tactical assessment of the enemy formation. Morrison felt the moment crystallizing around him. This was his opportunity to influence the battle, but it would require Captain Veltharim to risk her career. Evatarim. Send Fleet Command my compliments, Captain Veltharim said after a long pause, and inform them that the Relentless recommends immediate implementation of distributed tactical engagement protocols. Ma'am, there are no distributed tactical engagement protocols in Federation doctrine, the communications officer replied with obvious confusion. Then we're about to write them, the captain said grimly. Intended Morrison's tactical analysis to all ships in the fleet, along with my recommendation that individual commanders be granted tactical autonomy for independent operations. What followed was the most chaotic few minutes in Federation military communications history. The fleet commanders who had trained for decades in coordinated operations suddenly found themselves being asked to abandon formation and engage the enemy using individual tactical judgment. Some responded with confusion, others with outright refusal. But Admiral Ket Voren, commanding the fleet from the battlecruiser Indomitable, had access to the same tactical analysis that Morrison had provided. More importantly, he had been present for Morrison's earlier presentation about adaptive tactical thinking. Voren's voice echoed across fleet communications. You are authorized to break formation and engage enemy forces using independent tactical assessment. Repeat. You are authorized to engage using individual tactical judgment. The Federation battle line dissolved as 17 capital ships and their escorts suddenly began moving in ways that hadn't been seen since the early days of spaceflight. Some ships moved to engage the nearest enemy targets, others maneuvered to exploit gaps in the hegemony formation, and a few began implementing tactical approaches that Morrison suspected their commanders had been thinking about for years, but had never been allowed to try. The hegemony's response was immediate and telling. Their carefully prepared formation began to break apart as individual battle groups found themselves facing threats from unexpected directions. More importantly, their coordination degraded rapidly as the tactical situation evolved faster than their communication systems could relay information between units. Okay. It's working, Al-Rashid announced with barely contained excitement. The hegemony forces are losing cohesion because they can't coordinate responses to multiple independent threats. Morrison watched the battle develop on the main tactical display with a mixture of exhilaration and terror. The Federation fleet was fighting unlike anything in their military history, but it was also fighting more effectively than they had in months of encounters with hegemony forces. The Relentless herself was engaged with a hegemony-heavy cruiser, whose commander had apparently expected to face the Federation ship as part of a coordinated formation. Instead, Captain Veltharim was employing tactical approaches that Morrison recognized from human naval history, using the ship's superior maneuverability to stay outside the enemy's optimal firing arcs while concentrating firepower on vulnerable systems. Target their sensor arrays, Morrison suggested from his analysis station. If we degrade their ability to coordinate with other units, we force them into purely reactive tactics. Agreed, Captain Veltharim replied. Weapons target the enemy's communications and sensor systems. Let's see how well they fight when they can't talk to their friends. The engagement that followed demonstrated the effectiveness of adaptive tactics against an enemy prepared for conventional warfare. The hegemony cruiser found itself fighting a battle it hadn't trained for, while the Relentless exploited advantages that Federation doctrine had never emphasized. But Morrison's attention was focused on the larger tactical picture developing across the entire battle space. Individual Federation ships were engaging hegemony forces with tactical approaches that ranged from brilliant to suicidal, but the overall effect was exactly what he had hoped for. The enemy's carefully prepared battle plan was dissolving into reactive chaos. Fleet status report, Captain Beltram called for as the Relentless finished destroying its target. 14 Federation ships still operational, the communications officer replied. We've lost the frigates and Vigilant, and the cruiser Defiant is reporting heavy damage. Enemy losses are erratic, extensive. Morrison studied the tactical display with growing amazement. The Federation fleet had lost 3 ships, but the hegemony force was virtually destroyed. More importantly, they had achieved this victory while suffering casualties that were significantly lower than any tactical model had predicted for this engagement. How is this possible? Commander Katsurin asked, echoing Morrison's own thoughts. The enemy force was tactically superior and operationally prepared. We should have suffered much heavier losses. Because they prepared to fight the Federation fleet, Morrison replied. But we didn't fight like the Federation fleet. We fought like humans. The implications of what had just happened were staggering. A numerically superior Federation force had defeated a tactically sophisticated enemy by abandoning the coordinated approach that was the foundation of their military doctrine. Instead, they had fought using the kind of adaptive, independent tactics that were second nature to human military thinking, but revolutionary to most other Federation species. Cadet Morrison, Captain Veltharim said formally, your tactical recommendations have achieved results that will require significant revision to Federation military doctrine. I suspect your career trajectory has just changed dramatically. Morrison nodded, but his thoughts were already moving beyond the immediate tactical success. The victory at Meridian Reach had demonstrated that human approaches to warfare could be effective against sophisticated opponents. But it had also revealed something that might be even more significant, Captain, he said quietly. I don't think this was really about tactics. Explain. The hegemony forces were prepared for everything we might do according to Federation doctrine, Morrison continued, but they weren't prepared for approaches that came from outside that doctrine, which suggests that other Federation species might have similar tactical blind spots when facing human military thinking. Al-Rashid was studying her post-battle analysis with obvious fascination. Morrison's right, she announced. The electronic warfare techniques that were most effective against the hegemony were approaches that human military theory emphasizes, but Federation doctrine considers secondary, such as? Commander Ketsoram prompted, deception, misdirection, and psychological warfare. Al-Rashid replied. We didn't just defeat their ships. We defeated their expectations about how the battle would develop. The realization was spreading through the bridge crew with the kind of stunned recognition that accompanies paradigm shifts. The Federation had just discovered that their newest member species might possess military capabilities that were fundamentally different from anything else in the galaxy. Fleet Command is requesting detailed tactical analysis of the engagement, the communications officer reported. They want complete battle data forwarded to Strategic Planning Command for immediate review. Morrison knew that this battle report would be studied by military theorists across the Federation for decades to come. More immediately, it would likely result in major changes to military training and doctrine that would affect how the Federation approached warfare throughout the galaxy. But as he began compiling his analysis of the engagement, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that they had opened a door that might be difficult to close. The Federation had just learned that human approaches to warfare were devastatingly effective against opponents who thought they understood Federation capabilities. The question now was whether the galaxy was ready for what happened when humans stopped being mocked and started being feared. Rather than the journey back to Federation space with the survivors of the hegemony fleet in custody, Morrison found himself thinking about the Academy classmates who had dismissed human tactical thinking as primitive and chaotic. He wondered what they would think when they learned that the mocked Earth Marines had just revolutionized galactic warfare. More importantly, he wondered what would happen when other species realized that humanity's reputation for unpredictable adaptive warfare wasn't just historical curiosity, it was a strategic advantage that could change the balance of power throughout the galaxy. The victory at Meridian Reach was just the beginning. The real challenge would be dealing with success, and Morrison suspected that would prove even more difficult than dealing with mockery had ever been. 3 months after the Battle of Meridian Reach, Morrison stood before the assembled cadets of the Galactic Naval Academy's graduating class, wearing the insignia of a Federation tactical instructor, the youngest in Academy history. The irony wasn't lost on him that the human cadet who had been mocked for his unconventional approaches was now responsible for teaching those same approaches to the galaxy's future military leaders. The Academy itself had changed dramatically since his return. The human tactical methodology was now a required course for all senior cadets, and the Academy's simulation programs had been completely redesigned to emphasize adaptive thinking over rigid doctrine adherence. More significantly, the composition of incoming cadet classes had shifted, with human applications increasing by over 300% as word spread that humanity's military potential was finally being recognized. Today marks the final examination for advanced tactical innovation, Morrison announced to the assembled cadets, his voice carrying across the Academy's largest amphitheater. Security. You will be divided into mixed species units and tasked with developing solutions to tactical problems that have no precedent in Federation military history. The faces looking back at him represented 17 different species from across the galaxy, but Morrison noticed something that would have been impossible when he first arrived at the Academy. The alien cadets were listening with genuine attention rather than barely concealed skepticism. Respect, he had learned, was easier to earn than he had expected, but much harder to manage responsibly. Among the audience, Morrison spotted several familiar faces. Zeltok, the Veltar who had once dismissed him as pink-skin, now served as Morrison's assistant instructor, having discovered a remarkable aptitude for adaptive tactics once he overcame his species' traditional emphasis on honorable combat. Rexony had graduated with honors and was already serving aboard a Federation cruiser where her combination of Crixony and analytical precision and human-influenced tactical flexibility had earned rapid promotion. But the most significant change wasn't in individual relationships, it was in the fundamental approach that the Federation took toward military training and operations. The victory at Meridian Reach had triggered a comprehensive review of military doctrine that was still ongoing, with human tactical principles being integrated into training programs across all branches of Federation military service. Instructor Morrison, Cadet Tissus Coven, raised her hand, the young Zephani's telepathic abilities making her particularly adept at the coordinated operations that human tactics emphasized. The tactical problems we've studied all seem to emphasize unpredictability over coordination. How do we maintain unit cohesion when every individual is making independent tactical decisions? It was exactly the kind of question that Morrison had expected, and one that got to the heart of what made human military thinking different from the approaches favored by other Federation species. Present. Excellent question, Morrison replied, activating the amphitheater's holographic display system. The answer lies in understanding the difference between coordination and synchronization. The display showed two different fleet formations, one representing traditional Federation doctrine with ships arranged in precise geometric patterns, and another showing the looser, more flexible formation that had proven so effective against the hegemony. Traditional Federation tactics emphasize coordination, Morrison explained, highlighting the rigid structure of the first formation. Every unit has a predetermined role and follows specific protocols to achieve collective objectives. This approach works well against enemies who also follow predictable patterns, but it becomes a liability when facing opponents who can anticipate and counter your coordination. He shifted the display to show the more flexible formation. Human tactics emphasize synchronization instead. Units maintain awareness of overall objectives and friendly positions, but they're free to adapt their individual approaches based on developing circumstances. The key is shared understanding of intent rather than shared adherence to specific procedures. Cadet Malkuth, a Gorvani whose species had traditionally favored direct assault tactics, raised a massive arm. But how do you prevent units from working at cross purposes if they're all making independent decisions? Morrison smiled. It was a question that went to the heart of what made human military culture unique among Federation species. Through something we call mission-type orders, he explained. Instead of telling units exactly how to accomplish their objectives, you tell them what needs to be accomplished and why, then trust their tactical judgment to determine the best approach. The concept seemed to resonate with some cadets, while clearly challenging others. Morrison could see the divide that had emerged across the Academy between species that adapted easily to human tactical thinking and those that struggled with its apparent lack of structure. This is all theoretical, observed Cadet Ketbar, a Veltar whose skepticism reminded Morrison of his own early days at the Academy. How do we know these approaches will remain effective against opponents who have adapted to counter them? It was a fair question, and one that Morrison had been wrestling with himself. The Federation's adoption of human tactics had been dramatically successful against the hegemony, but warfare was an evolutionary process where yesterday's advantages could become tomorrow's vulnerabilities. We don't, Morrison admitted frankly. Which is exactly why adaptive thinking is more important than any specific tactical approach. The moment we become predictable, even if we're predictably unpredictable, we become vulnerable to opponents who can anticipate our responses. The discussion that followed demonstrated how much the Academy's intellectual environment had evolved since Morrison's arrival. Cadets from different species were engaging seriously with tactical concepts that their predecessors would have dismissed as chaotic human thinking. More importantly, they were developing their own innovations based on the intersection between human adaptability and their species' traditional military strengths. The precedent, Instructor Morrison Cadet Al-Kathani, a Crixani whose compound eyes glittered with what Morrison had learned, indicated excitement. I've been analyzing the battle data from recent engagements where Federation forces have employed adaptive tactics. The most successful operations seem to combine human unpredictability with species-specific advantages. Elaborate, Morrison requested, curious to see where the cadets' analysis was leading. Beltar honor codes actually enhance adaptive tactics when properly applied, Al-Kathani explained, manipulating the holographic display to show tactical analysis data. Their emphasis on individual warrior excellence translates perfectly to independent tactical decision-making. Prizes allow for rapid assessment of developing tactical situations. Even Gorvani preference for direct assault becomes more effective when applied unpredictably rather than as a standard approach. Morrison nodded approvingly. You've identified something that took our tactical analysts months to recognize. Human military thinking isn't about replacing other approaches. It's about integrating them in ways that maximize their effectiveness while minimizing their predictability. The realization was spreading through the amphitheater like a chain reaction. Morrison could see cadets beginning to understand that the revolution in Federation military thinking wasn't about humans imposing their methods on other species. It was about all species learning to think more flexibly about warfare. Unannounced, Morrison announced, activating a new series of displays that showed tactical scenarios he had personally designed based on intelligence reports from the Federation's outer territories. Picture has been studying our recent tactical innovations, Morrison continued. Your challenge is to develop countermeasures against enemies who have specifically prepared to face adaptive Federation tactics. The silence that followed was profound. The students to solve a problem that Federation Strategic Command was currently struggling with. How to maintain tactical advantage against opponents who had learned to anticipate their adaptability. You have 4 hours, Morrison announced. Teams of 5 mixed species composition. Your solutions will be transmitted directly to Fleet Command for evaluation. What followed was the most intense tactical analysis session Morrison had ever witnessed at the Academy. Teams of cadets from different species worked with desperate intensity to develop approaches that could counter enemies who had specifically prepared for human-influenced Federation tactics. Morrison circulated among the teams, observing approaches that ranged from brilliant to bizarre. One team was developing what they called meta-adaptive tactics that involved deliberately appearing to follow predictable patterns while actually implementing completely different strategies. Another was working on cascade unpredictability that used sequential tactical shifts to stay ahead of enemy adaptation cycles. But it was the team led by Cadet Tisses Coven that developed the most innovative approach. The young Zafani had combined her species' telepathic coordination abilities with human unpredictability concepts to create something entirely new. We call it intuitive synchronization, she explained when Morrison stopped to review their work. Instead of coordinating through communication systems that can be intercepted and analyzed, we coordinate through telepathic links that provide shared tactical awareness without predetermined responses. Morrison studied their tactical framework with growing excitement, so units would share real-time awareness of battlefield conditions and friendly positions, but each would develop independent responses based on that shared information. Exactly, this Coven confirmed. The enemies could intercept our communications and analyze our coordination patterns, but they couldn't predict our responses because even we wouldn't know what we were going to do until the tactical situation developed. It was brilliant, and Morrison realized that his students were already thinking beyond the tactical innovations that had made him famous. They were developing approaches that could maintain Federation advantages even against enemies who understood and had prepared for human military thinking. The examination results, when they were compiled, exceeded Morrison's most optimistic expectations. Every team had developed tactical approaches that showed genuine innovation, and several had produced concepts that would likely influence Federation military doctrine for decades to come. But Morrison's satisfaction with his students' progress was tempered by reports he had been receiving from Federation intelligence. The galaxy had taken notice of humanity's military potential, and not all of the attention was welcome. Instructor Morrison. Commander Vexnera appeared at his side as the examination session concluded. Her expression was unreadable, but Morrison had learned to recognize subtle signs of concern in her alien features. "Ma'am, report to Admiral Keth Foran's office immediately," she said quietly. "There have been developments that require your immediate attention." Morrison felt his stomach tighten. In decadence, in his experience, urgent meetings with senior officers were rarely about good news. Admiral Keth Foran's office had been redesigned since Morrison's last visit, with tactical displays and strategic analysis equipment that suggested it had become more of a command center. The Admiral himself stood before a holographic star map that showed Federation space marked with indicators Morrison didn't recognize. "Ah, Morrison," the Admiral rumbled as he entered. "Performance. Fleet Command has reviewed their tactical innovations with considerable interest." "Thank you, sir," Morrison replied, though he suspected compliments weren't the reason for the urgent summons. "However," Admiral Keth Foran continued, "their innovations may be needed sooner than we anticipated. Intelligence reports suggest that several major galactic powers have begun implementing their own versions of adaptive tactics, specifically designed to counter Federation forces." Morrison studied the star map with growing concern. The indicators he couldn't identify were apparently showing military buildups by non-Federation species across multiple sectors. "How serious is the threat?" Morrison asked. "Potentially existential," the Admiral replied grimly. "The Altarian hegemony has reportedly restructured their entire military around what they call chaos warfare, designed to match human unpredictability. The Zephyrian Empire has begun training their officers in adaptive thinking methodologies. Even the isolationist Gorvani clans have shown interest in tactical flexibility concepts." The implications were staggering. Morrison had helped introduce tactical concepts that had given the Federation decisive advantages, but now those same concepts were spreading throughout the galaxy as other species sought to match human military capabilities. "Sir, what are you asking me to do?" Admiral Keth Foran's expression was grim. "I'm asking you to help us stay ahead of opponents who are learning to think like humans," he said. "Because if we can't maintain our tactical edge, the Federation may face military challenges that dwarf anything we've encountered before." Morrison nodded slowly, understanding the magnitude of what was being asked. The success of human tactical thinking had triggered a galactic arms race in military innovation, and humanity was being called upon to help the Federation maintain its edge in a conflict environment that was evolving faster than anyone had anticipated. "I'll need access to current intelligence on enemy tactical development," Morrison said, "and authority to recruit the most innovative tactical thinkers from across all Federation species."
"Granted," Admiral Keth Foran replied immediately.
"Assemble your team and begin immediate analysis of countermeasures for adaptive enemy tactics. The galaxy has learned to respect human military thinking. Now we need to prove that respect was justified." As Morrison left the Admiral's office, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since arriving at the Academy as a mocked human cadet struggling to keep up with alien classmates. Now he was being asked to help defend the Federation against enemies who had learned to copy the very approaches that had made him successful. The Academy's corridors buzzed with activity as news of the new threat assessment spread through the faculty and senior cadets. Morrison could see the same mixture of excitement and apprehension in alien faces that he felt himself. They had proven that human military thinking could revolutionize galactic warfare, but they were about to discover whether it could evolve fast enough to stay ahead of opponents who were determined to match human capabilities. That evening, as Morrison worked late in his office reviewing intelligence reports and planning his new tactical development program, he received a communication that brought everything full circle. It was from Zeltok, now serving aboard the Federation cruiser Dauntless in the Outer Rim territories. Morrison, the Veltar's image, said from the holographic display, "I wanted you to know that our mixed-species tactical unit achieved a decisive victory against a hegemony force that was using adaptive countermeasures specifically designed to defeat Federation innovation tactics. Your teaching methods are proving effective even against enemies who think they understand them." Morrison smiled as he composed his reply. The key is never to stop learning," he typed. Back warfare is the moment we think we've mastered warfare, is the moment we become vulnerable to opponents who are still innovating. As he sent the message and returned to his tactical analysis, Morrison realized that his journey from mock cadet to respected instructor was just the beginning. The galaxy was learning to fight like humans, which meant that humans would need to learn to fight like something the galaxy had never seen before. The real test of human military potential wasn't in proving that their approaches could work. It was in proving that those approaches could continue working even when everyone knew what they were. Morrison had once been dismissed as chaotic and undisciplined by alien classmates who thought they understood warfare. Now he was responsible for ensuring that the Federation could stay ahead of enemies who thought they understood chaos. The irony was profound, but the responsibility was greater. The mocked Earth Marine had become the galaxy's tactical innovator, and the survival of everything he cared about depended on his ability to keep surprising opponents who were determined not to be surprised. As he worked through the night, developing training programs and tactical frameworks that would push military thinking into entirely uncharted territory, Morrison couldn't help but smile at the thought of how his old academy classmates would react to learning that the human they had dismissed was now responsible for defending the entire Federation. The kill ratios had been revealed, and they showed something that no alien species had expected. Humans didn't just survive in galactic warfare, they redefined it. The question now was whether they could redefine it fast enough to stay ahead of a galaxy that was finally learning to take humanity seriously. The Academy had mocked Earth Marines, but the galaxy would remember them as the species that taught everyone else how to fight wars they couldn't afford to lose.